Okay, so originally I gave this presentation in English, slides are in English, so I'll be talking English. I hope everyone is okay with that. Hopefully. Yeah. Great to hear that. So I am now working at the Airhope company. I would like to tell a few words about us because the examples that I use here are closely related to what we do. So we help passengers claim their rights. So whenever a flight is delayed or cancelled, there is a law in the European Union and in the United States and other countries as well, but that's not our area for now. That when the flight is delayed more than a couple of hours and it's not on objective circumstances like bad weather, but it's basically a cancellation or a delay because someone overslept or overbooking, that you go and the airline sold more tickets than places available in the airline. So you're eligible to get compensation for that, and we help passengers get that compensation because it's not an easy process. Different airlines deal with that differently. Some require regular mail, some require faxes, some have web forms. And I don't know if most, but lots of times the airlines don't want to pay. So we have quite a big legal team that fights in courts for passengers, for the rights, basically. Okay, so let's get to the talk. The talk is about best practices in Rspec. Those are not necessarily objectively best practices, but practices that I consider to be the best. And I like to follow them, and I like my team to also follow them. So, first one is quite easy. I recommend using the format documentation setting when executing Rspec, so that you don't have the dots for the test, but you actually have a list, and each line is basically a test description, a docstring, so to speak.
Even for example, when you have hide big amount of the test?
Yes, definitely. Even with thousands of tests, I think it helps. I think this makes tests more readable. So when you look at the output of your tests, and it's nice, like it reads well, like describe some method should create user, or creates user. Should is not a word to use. That will be on the next slide. So a method creates user, and if the output with using the format documentation is good, that when you read the spec, it's also better because you have to only look at the doc strings in the spec to know what is actually inside the spec. You don't have to necessarily read the spec if the doc strings are good. So this is my global.rspec file. I use color, I use also profile 5, so that the default is 10, I think. So that the output of profiling is a little bit smaller. So I recommend using format documentation. So next recommendation is you shouldn't use the should keyword. So this is because originally Rspec would add the should method to Ruby object. So each object that would be created would have this should method, and you could not have a should method in your Ruby object. It also caused problems with proxy object. So there was basically a big talk and a big move towards not using the should and not putting this method on object or on all Ruby objects. So it's better if you write it creates a new claim instead of it should create a new claim. And I think that even that reads better because this is what a method does. It creates a new claim, it creates a new object. So also for those one-liners, like when you do a subject of something, like subject create model, and you write those one-line specs. So previously you would write it, curly braces should be valid, and now you could write from Rspec 3.0 forward, it is expected to be valid. Expect is also the word to use now instead of should. That's not on the slide. I also recommend using the should and matchers gem. It provides you with a couple of classes of matchers that lets you write more concise specs. So for relationships, you could write it is expected to belong to flight, right? So for example, it could be a spec for the claim model. So this not only tests that the models, that this model has a belongs to flight method inside it, but it also tests that there's a database column with basically flight ID, name, and that it's an integer, so that it's all related, right? So if you wanted to test all of that, you would have to write a couple of specs, and using this gem basically makes it more concise, makes it more easier to write, I think. It also provides a lot of matchers to, I think, most, if not all, Rails validations. So here are a couple of examples. It is expected to validate presence of name, to validate uniqueness of, and to validate format of. Any validation basically you can think of, you could write it like that and it would test it. And uniqueness validation is probably something that I like the most, because it actually, the test, like this line, actually tries to create two records with the same email, and the second record, it makes an assertion that the second record is invalid and that the email field is invalid because it is not unique. So having those kind of validations really helps. And also another class of matchers is for controller responses or controller behavior. So when you write specs for controller, it's nice to write like it is expected to respond with success. So for successful execution of a controller action, or it should redirect to new claim path, or it should render a template. It is expected to. Okay, clear?
Yeah.
Great. Yes, so another recommendation is to use proper doc strings. Oh, sorry. So when you write specs for a model, there's a convention to use a describe, and in the doc string use a hash and the name of the method that you describe if it's an instance method. And for class methods, you use a dot. And for other type of specs, basically a decent description what this spec does is really nice to have. It's again the same example. It creates a new claim. So Rspec provides us also with the context keyword, I think, and it's mostly, but not only, used to denote different code path executions. Like here it could be a context for a controller spec when there is an existing claim for this user, and context when there are no existing claims by this user. You could also imagine a context like when user is logged in or when user is logged out. So it's nice to start the context with the when word. Again, it reads better, and you can see that in here, and you can see it more clearly when you use the format documentation. Another recommendation is to use the let. Like, does everyone know what let does? Or who doesn't know what let does? Okay, thank you. Yes, so let lets you create a block, a proc of code that will be evaluated the first time that this symbol is used in a spec. So Here I'm using let user ID. It's a random string there. I'm defining also some params. So it will basically create a method called params. It will create a method called user ID, but this method will be executed only when there's a call to that method in the actual spec. So when we have the spec, it creates account with user ID set, and when we say account equals create account dot call, so create account, we have that it's a, guess what, service object. Create account dot new params, right? So let create, this block of code, this proc, will be executed when there's a reference to create account in this spec. And this in turn will execute params, and this in turn will execute user ID, right? It's like create account, and here this will execute this params, user ID, and user ID. So everything of that will be executed. There's one caveat that this is a little bit of indirection. Like when you normally read specs, you start from the it block account, and you have something here that you don't really know what that is, and you have to scroll up, like, or move your eyes. What is create account? Create account is this. Oh, okay. Now what are params? Okay, params is this. Okay, what is user ID? Okay, and where was I? And you have to scroll down, and so this is not entirely great, but it really helps to make your spec smaller, and it's really useful when you have lots of small specs that deal with the same data. Like you could imagine that this call could, for example, have different params, and there would be different side effects of this create account call method that you would like to test different paths in code.
I have a question to this slide. Is there any reason that you are using a empty line between the expect and service calling in the it?
Yes, there will be a slide about it.
Okay.
But a little bit spoiler, it's to basically separate setting up of the test from expectations, from assertions, so that the spec itself is grouped into parts. Like in this example, perhaps it's too small to have this empty line, but usually specs are longer, and this division helps. I'll talk about it a little bit later. Yes, so we have let, and we have let with an exclamation mark. So this helps if you want to have this block in here. For that it's create airline. If you want to have this block executed before the spec is run, so use the exclamation mark, and it will basically create this airline object. It's using factory girl here, so that this object will be available in the database before spec is run. So it's usually done for future specs, for acceptance specs, but not only. So it's like good to know that when let doesn't work, you could use let with an exclamation mark. Okay, so you don't necessarily have to use let all the time. Like it's okay to write a fairly comprehensive spec with all variables defined inside the spec and not in let blocks, like for shorter specs and for specs that basically don't share, like when you don't have many specs using the same params, like create account new, for example, same variables, you could include it like this. So you set it up, account params like that, create account new. This is the execution step, and this is the assertion steps. So basically, like it's not a rule that you shouldn't use let or that you should use let. Like, it's up to you. You can do it like this, or you can do it like this. Both are fine, but it's your decision which one you prefer better. I tend to use this way more than that, but it depends. For example, for model specs, yes. For controller specs, I tend to use let. Because, well, controller specs usually have those many different code paths, many different conditions, like if user is persisted, if user is saved, then that, if not, then that. So let in that case helps. Okay. So, I also recommend writing unit specs when you write. When you write unit specs at a unit level. So what does it mean? What I mean by that is that all external dependencies for the class that is currently under test should be mocked out, so that you don't test the integration, because you don't necessarily need to test the integration at the unit level. There are other type of specs for that. So when you have this create account service object with a call method, and this executes create account, and this actually executes the active record create method. So when you write a spec for this create account, it's fine to say that account should receive, or account is expected to receive create with that and that params, because that's what we really want to spec, that the message create is passed to the account class. This is what we want to test. There will be an example for that, I think. Yes, so that's about this division, but it's basically a more complex example of this create account service object. Like, there's actually, this is a spec for find for create account service object, so it's one that executes create account if account is not found. So as I was speaking previously, it's good to divide your specs into different parts. Like here is the setup part. We create variables, we assign them numbers, we create a double for create account service object, we set up some hash with params, and as I said, like when we have in this find and create account, when we have a method called account find by user ID, it's fine to make an expectation like that. They expect account to receive find by and return nil. So in this case, it means that the account doesn't exist for this user, right? And this in turn will execute the create account new, and create account will receive call. So this is the expectation part, and this is the execution or assertions part. So for those types of specs that you set up mocks on method execution, those are basically mocks for method execution, expect to receive, the order is that you first set up, then you assert, and then you execute. For normal, for regular specs, you would have those two blocks reversed. So you would first have the execution block, so a call, method execution, file create account, service object, and then you would assert that account was created with this user ID. Okay. So another recommendation is to not write specs for private methods. So when we have a service object like that, again, create account, it's sufficient to just write specs for the call method. Because most of the time, if not always, all of those private methods will be executed. So you don't need to write that account params is a hash that has this, this, and this. Like in this example, we had that tested in here, like expect create account to receive new with create account params. Right? So it's perfectly tested, 100% coverage. So don't write specs for private methods. Another recommendation is to write specs for all possible cases, because the code coverage metric that many people like to use doesn't tell you everything. Like, it's not enough that the test, when it executes the code, that the whole code was executed. Like, it's not enough. It's better, much better to actually test every line or every method or every possible code path. When there's an if or when there's a case, it's very good to test it for all possible conditions. And here is a fragment of a spec for a controller, for the show action in the controller, and it uses contexts to differentiate between different code paths, like when the claim is found, when the claim is not found, or when the claim is not owned. So it's always good to remember when you write specs to think when you finish writing them whether you have covered all aspects, all possible cases. And here's a different or a method to share examples or share specs between different specs, share specs fragments. So here I defined a shared example, a model with attachment. So attachment here is an attribute on a model called message. So I could expect that this message has an attachment model that can be uploaded by the user. So when you have one model with an attachment, you don't necessarily need shared examples. But when you do use more than one model that have attachment, it's good to use shared examples in this case. And there are many cases when you could use shared examples for any shared behavior between classes. So it's basically quite easy. You just defined it in an arbitrary file under spec support shared examples. This directory could be named differently as well, because by default everything under spec support is included. So this is quite a simple spec. Basically attaches. It creates a model and attaches an attachment. So the attribute is attachment, so it attaches attachment to attachment attribute, and expects that the model is valid. And here I had to use public send because this attribute is a symbol, right? So that I could execute a method, so that this model actually did receive this file and do have this attachment. So I spoke previously about writing unit specs, so specs for models at unit level, but I am also a fan of writing controller specs at unit level. And what I mean by that is that all calls to service objects or all calls to active record methods should be mocked out, and it's the same technique. Expect airport here is an active record model to receive find with some code. ICAO is a code for airports. It's a standard for basically airport codes. So it should receive, it's expected to receive, and it will return airport. And airport here is a double actually. We could use factory girl here. We could say create airport here, but that would not be okay, in my opinion. Like using double like that here is much better. As a side bonus, this spec will run probably 10 or 20 times faster than the one that would store the objects in the database. So the airport is the database object. It should be expect to receive. It should be mocked up like this, but also calls to service object, because service objects are external to controller. So different classes. This create claim, I'm pretty sure I have a unit level spec for that written. That's very comprehensive. So I don't need to test it again, writing an integration spec for this controller. Like, I want to only test the controller for what is inside the controller. So any external execution, I just looked at. And it's fine, it works quite fine. Like expect, create claim to receive new with claim params and return claim. Claim I'm here. Claim is defined, it should be let claim, double claim. And with that expectations in place, I execute a post. I usually do it in the before block so that I could use those shoulda matchers, those one-line matchers. So this is all in the before block. And it's enough to assert on the response, because it's the job of controller to provide a response. To either redirect, to respond with an HTTP code, perhaps to render some flash message, or perhaps to render a template, or to render a different action. So this is all covered by shoulda matchers, and it's enough. It's controller test or controller spec at unit level. But I do recommend using factory girl, and I do recommend creating objects in the database, and I do recommend integration or acceptance specs, because they combine all of your code together. They boot up the application for acceptance specs. I'm a fan of Capybara acceptance specs. And I like using factory girl to do that. Here I'm using a trait for factory girl, so it will create a special airline, well-known one, I hope. It will create an airport, another airport. Now that I think of it, those should probably be named like destination airport, starting airport. It also creates a flights, and it defines a scenario, filing a claim for a cancelled flight. So this will test everything. This will test our active record models. This will test our service objects. This will test our controllers. This will test our views. So this will basically test everything. So in here, the background is basically the same as before. It's just another alias for this method, for this keyword, so that this spec reads a little bit nicer than describe background and scenario. Scenario is basically it block from our spec. And my preference is not to use let in here. You could use that, it's also fine. I just prefer not to. Mostly because you would have to use the let with an exclamation mark all over the place, because you don't necessarily reference any models in here. Like this spec will be written at UI level, so it will be visit route path, click on fire claim, fill in starting airport with something, fill in destination airport, etc. etc. Okay. And last recommendation is when you do have some external API that you have to query. Like here we use the Pioneer for payouts. We have an app or a class, like in here the Pioneer gateway, that makes external API requests the recommendation is to mock them out. And there's a really great gem for that, but Bartosz Blinke, that lets you mock out requests in a really nice way. Like you only write stub request, the request type, get to some URI. The URI is defined in here. To return status success, so 200 response code, and with a body that is defined here, like some JSON created from a hash. And when you set it up like that, the spec is really nice and really easy. Pioneer gateway, new response, JSON parse, Pioneer gateway sign up URL is actually the actual method on the Pioneer gateway. And the sign up the response URL is from this JSON parsed from this JSON. And at the end, the expectance block, the assertion block, expect sign up to equal URL. This is one defined here. And that's it. Thank you very much. Any questions?
For HTTP request, did you also use the VCR again?
Yes, that's also an option. I haven't personally used it. It's good. Also, I think it's perhaps too good. Like it basically saves the whole response. Well, like when you use that, you basically just can have just one para. While with VCR, you will have this whole HTML or JSON response from the server, and this response would most likely be outdated within a couple of days or a couple of weeks, because well, web services change, and they can change like in a tiny amount, but with the VCR you have it saved in a version that is past in time. So not a big fan, but it's an option, and sure, you could also use that.
And do you have any maybe solution how to test such a situation when you have some API request and do you use
it changes.
Yeah, it changes. And
Yeah,
do you use fixtures or something like that?
Well, the two solutions are two, I think. One is that you have real users, and real users will complain to you the moment it stops working. So if you have many users, you don't necessarily have to have any tests for that. You just can mock it out like that and it's perfectly fine. You could make actual calls to external service. For example, you could put sandbox dot something in here and it would query each time. It's a bad solution because when your network is down, your test basically stops working, and your tests become much slower. And there's a free solution, I think. You could also have some daemon or some background job running that would periodically query the API with your code and would check for the response. It would be executed, for example, every hour or every 30 minutes. It would be more like a reporting service, not necessarily a spec, more like a monitoring reporting service. That's also an option. But I tend to use real users, and that pretty much works most of the time.
I think that it's external not to test the real API and let our users report that something broke. This is too extreme. I think that there need to be a few tests that will touch directly the API, and they will do the most important things. That is, accept the payment, something like that, and they need to run during the builds all the time. But there needs to be only a few of them, and the rest, of course, that do all the things that aren't that necessary. They can be mocked out. That's how I do it.
Sure, that's an option. Like you could, for example, have some type of specs, and you could exclude a certain type of specs
Yes.
from running locally, but you include it when your specs run on your CI server.
Yeah, and wrap it with a timeout block so it doesn't
Yes.
slow it down.
For example.
when they are.
But this, well, it depends on the timeout that you set.
Yeah.
Because you might have false positives. Right? So it failed, but it actually works. So I think it's January, but anyway, just use a timeout that is appropriately long, but not too long. Okay, any other questions? Okay, thank you very much.